Meanwhile, Ivan Ilyitch was moved to a little leather sofa that stood in the dining room. While they were clearing the tables and putting them away, Pseldonimov was rushing all over the place to borrow money. He even tried to get it from the servants, but it appeared nobody had any. He even ventured to trouble Akim Petrovitch, who had stayed after the other guests. But good-natured as he was, the latter was reduced to such bewilderment and even alarm at the mention of money that he uttered the most unexpected and foolish phrases. "Another time, with pleasure," he muttered. "But now, you really must excuse me." And taking his cap, he ran as fast as he could out of the house. Only the good-natured youth who had talked about the dream book was of any use at all, and even then that came to nothing. He, too, stayed after the others, showing genuine sympathy with Pseldonimov's misfortunes. At last Pseldonimov, together with his mother and the young man, decided in consultation not to send for a doctor, but rather to fetch a carriage and take the invalid home, and meantime to try certain domestic remedies till the carriage arrived, such as moistening his temples and his head with cold water, putting ice on his head, and so on. Pseldonimov's mother undertook this task. The friendly youth flew off in search of a carriage. As there were not even ordinary cabs to be found on Petersburg Slide at that hour, he went off to some livery stables at a distance to wake up the coachman. They began bargaining, and declaring that 5 rubles would be little to ask for a carriage at that time of night. They agreed to come, however, for 3. When at last, just before 5 o'clock, the young man arrived at Pseldonimov's with a carriage, they had changed their minds. It appeared that Ivan Ilyitch, who was still unconscious, had become so seriously unwell, was moaning and tossing so terribly, that to move him and take him home in such a condition was impossible and actually unsafe. "What will it lead to next?" said Pseldonimov, utterly disheartened. What is to be done?" A new problem arose. If the invalid was to be remained in the house, where should he be moved, and where could they put him? There were only 2 bedsteads in the house, one large double bed in which old Mekhlepotov and his wife slept, and another double bed of imitation walnut which had just been purchased and was destined for the newly married couple. All the other inhabitants of the house slept on the floor side by side on feather beds, for the most part in bad condition and stuffy. Anything but presentable, in fact, and even of these the supply was insufficient. There was not one to spare. Where could the invalid be put? A feather bed might perhaps have been found. It might in the last resort have been pulled from under someone, but where and on what could the bed have been made up? It seemed that the bed must be made up in the drawing room, for that room was the farthest from the bosom of the family, and had a door into the passage. But on what could the bed be made? Surely not upon chairs. We all know that beds can only be made up on chairs for schoolboys when they come home for the weekend, and it would be terribly lacking in respect to make up a bed in that way for a personage like Ivan Ilyitch. What would be said next morning when he found himself lying on chairs? Pseldonimov would not hear of that. The only alternative was to put him on the bridal couch. The bridal couch, as we have mentioned already, was in a little room that opened out of the dining room. On the bedstead was a double mattress, actually newly bought, first hand, clean sheets, 4 pillows in a pink calico covered with frilled muslin cases. The quilt was of pink satin, and it was quilted in patterns. Muslin curtains hung down from a golden ring overhead. In fact, it was all just as it should be, and the guests who had all visited the bridal chamber had admired the decoration of it. Though the bride could not endure Pseldonimov, she had several times in the course of the evening run in to have a look at it on the sly. What was her indignation, her wrath, when she learned that they meant to move an invalid, suffering from something not unlike a mild attack of cholera, to her bridal couch! The bride's mother took her part, broke into abuse, and vowed she would complain to her husband next day. But Pseldonimov asserted himself and insisted. Ivan Ilyitch was moved into the bridal chamber, and a bed was made up on the chair for the young people. The bride whimpered, would have liked to pinch him, but dared not disobey. Her papa had a crutch with him, which she was very familiar, and she knew that her papa would call her to account next day. To console her, they carried the pink satin quilt and the pillows and muslin cases into the drawing room. At that moment the youth arrived with the carriage, and was horribly alarmed that the carriage was not wanted. he was left to pay for it himself, and he never had as much as 10 kopeck piece. Pseldonimov explained that he was utterly bankrupt. They tried to parley with the driver, but he began to be noisy and even to batter on the shutters. How it ended, I don't know exactly. I believe the youth was carried off to Dstysky by way of a hostage to the 4th Rodzinski Street, where he was hoped to rouse a student who was spending the night at a friend's, and to try whether he had any money. It was going on for 6 o'clock in the morning when the young people were left alone and shut up in the drawing room. Pseldonimov's mother spent the whole night by the bedside of the sufferer. She installed herself on the rug on the floor and covered herself with an old coat, but could not sleep because she had to get up every minute. Ivan Ilyitch had a terrible attack of colic. Madame Pseldonimov, a woman of courage and greatness of soul, undressed him with her own hands, took off all his things, looked after him as if he were her own son, and spent the whole night carrying basins, etc., from the bedroom across the passage and bringing them back again empty. And yet the misfortunes of that night were not yet over. No more than 10 minutes after the young people had been shut up alone in the drawing room, a piercing shriek was suddenly heard, not a cry of joy, but a shriek of the most sinister kind. The screams were followed by a noise, a crash, as though of the falling of chairs, and instantly there burst into the still dark room a perfect crowd of exclaiming, frightened women, attired in every kind of dishabille. These women were the bride's mother, her eldest sister, abandoning for the moment the sick children and her 3 aunts. Even the one with a broken rib dragged herself in. Even the cook was there, and the German lady who told stories, whose own feathery bed, the best in the house and her only property, had been forcibly dragged from under her for the young couple, trailed in together with the others. All these respectable and sharp-eyed ladies had, a quarter of an hour before, made their way on tiptoe from the kitchen across the passage, and were listening in the ante-room, devoured by an unaccountable curiosity. Meanwhile, someone lighted a candle, and a surprising spectacle met their eyes all. The chairs supported the broad feather bed, only at the sides had parted under the weight, and the feather bed had fallen between them on the floor. The bride was sobbing with anger. This time she was mortally offended. Pseldonimov, morally shattered, stood like a criminal caught in a crime. He did not even attempt to defend himself. Shrieks and exclamations sounded on all sides. Pseldonimov's mother ran up at the noise, but the bride's mamma on this occasion got the upper hand. She began by showering strange, and for the most part quite undeserved reproaches, such as, "A nice husband you are, after this! What are you good for, after such a disgrace?" and so on, and at last carried her daughter away from her husband, undertaking to bear the full responsibility for doing so with her ferocious husband, who would demand an explanation. All the others followed her out, exclaiming and shaking their heads. No one remained with Pseldonimov except his mother, who tried to comfort him, but he sent her away at once. He was beyond consolation. He made his way to the sofa and sat down in the most gloomy confusion of mind, just as he was, barefoot and in nothing but his night attire. His thoughts whirled in a tangled criss-cross in his mind. At times he mechanically looked about the room where only a little while ago the dancers had been whirling madly, and in which the cigarette smoke still lingered. Cigarette ends and sweetmeat papers still littered the slopped and dirty floor. The wreck of the nuptial couch and the overturned chairs bore witness to the transitoriness of the fondest and surest earthly hopes and dreams. He sat like this almost an hour. The most oppressive thoughts kept coming into his mind, such as the doubt, what was in store for him in the office now? He recognized with painful clearness that he would have, at all costs, to exchange into another department, that he could not possibly remain where he was after all that had happened that evening. He thought, too, of Mekopotov, who would probably make him dance the Cossack dance next day to test his meekness. He reflected, too, that though Mekopotov had given 50 rubles for the wedding festivities, every farthing which had been spent, he had not thought of giving him the 400 rubles yet. No mention had been made of it, in fact, and, indeed, even the house had not been formally made over to him. He thought, too, of his wife, who had left him at the most critical moment of his life. of the tall officer who had dropped on one knee before her. He had noticed that already. He thought of the 7 devils which, according to the testimony of her own father, were in possession of his wife, and of the crutch in readiness to drive them out. Of course, he felt equal to bearing a great deal, but destiny had let loose such surprises upon him that he might well doubt of his fortitude. So Pseldonimov mused dolefully. Meanwhile the candle end was going out, its fading light falling straight upon Pseldonimov's profile, through a colossal shadow of it on the wall, with a drawn-out neck, a hooked nose, and 2 tufts of hair sticking out on his forehead and the back of his head. At last, when the air was growing cool with the chill of early morning, he got up, frozen and spiritually numb, crawled to the feather bed that was lying between the chairs, and without rearranging anything, without putting out the candle end, without even laying the pillow under his head, fell into a leaden, death-like sleep, such as the sleep of men condemned to flogging on the morrow must be.